Welcome to Moving Conversations, a podcast for movement professionals by movement professionals. If you coach, train, or teach movement, Pilates, or fitness, then this podcast is for you. With more than 60 years of experience in fitness and Pilates, your hosts, Brian Ritchie and Nora St. John, explore the science of human movement, diving deep into the facts, myths, and common misconceptions, hoping to spark thought and conversation about how we view fitness and movement. Now, let's jump into Moving Conversations. And welcome back to Moving Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie. Joining me as always is Nora St. John. How's it going this morning, Nora?
Quite delightful. We've got a little bit of fall weather coming in and life's looking pretty good around here. A little cooler, which is nice.
Yeah, very cool around here. We've been...
Yeah,
most mornings leaving the house, it's been about 45 degrees.
Okay.
So yeah, it changed on a dime. It changed
It
literally
did.
on a dime. And DC has this weird, thing being between two bodies of water that it's always humid. So it just feels colder a little bit,
A lot colder.
So we
Yeah.
get the humidity of the summer, which feels stifling. And then during the winter, it's just sort of bites a little bit. And we're experiencing a little bit of that. So we're expecting some fall foliage. Do you guys get any real fall foliage in Sacramento?
Sacramento does, just because we have so many trees.
Uh-huh.
Sacramento is like the city of trees. And again, we're like you, our bodies of water are two big rivers that come through. So there's a lot of water kind of not too far under the surface. So yeah, we do. They're around Thanksgiving. So it's just starting to change
wow.
now.
Okay.
And it'll be more like, into November that you'll really see the change here.
Yeah, ours is just starting as well. But ours usually goes
Yeah.
fairly quickly.
Yeah. Yep. I think I've been there right after the fall and
Yeah.
watched like the gigantic piles of leaves the size of like a small semi that get developed there. It's
Yes.
unbelievable.
Yes, I was actually walking out this morning to the car looking at the ground going, oh man, I got to start raking this stuff up again. And I know it's just the beginning. It's just the beginning for the next month. It's a month of raking nonstop before it's all gone. So last week we talked about the shoulder and basically we covered the anatomy, we covered movement quality, that sort of thing. Thought great idea for today would be part 2. Let's get into some pathologies. Let's get into imbalances. And I think we'll start with imbalances because, as you said, they can lead to pathologies. But yeah, I thought that way we'd do a little deeper dive because pretty much everybody's working with somebody that's got a rotator cuff issue or, they go to reach their arms overhead. I was just talking with a client literally this morning. He's had a shoulder thing that comes and goes for a long time. And I was just talking about movement quality. I said, your right arm, your scapulohumeral rhythm is normal. I said, as you lift your arm up, I can see everything moving. As soon as you go to lift that left arm, you shrug your shoulder, your arm shoots up, and it's almost as though he's trying to do it so fast to avoid the pain that I said, you're creating the pain.
Yeah.
You're not avoiding it. And it was a big surprise to him. He said, really? He had no idea. So I thought, you know what? Yeah. And in my head, I'm thinking, okay, starting next week, we're going to start, he's a big golfer. So all he wanted to focus on this summer was golf. And I said, okay, now it's time for us to start focusing a little bit more on this. Let's break this down a little bit more and do a little bit of release work and stuff like that. So let's talk muscular imbalance. What do you usually see when you see muscular imbalances with the shoulder?
But really, really typical stuff. So, from Yonda a million years ago, upper cross syndrome, tight in the front, weak in the back.
Yep.
Right. So the pec major, the pec minor can be tight, shoulders round forward. And then the whole upper back musculature can often be just super weak. Again, from everything we do every day, sitting at our computers, playing on our smartphones, that's where we live. We live a little bit hunched forward and all that.
Yep.
So when I think about that, I'm often focusing with clients, even from day one, on getting their back shoulder muscles stronger, just like putting the shoulders back, working on the upper back, working on the thoracic, just to get that going. So that's a typical one. And then what you mentioned too is we're looking at how somebody lifts their arm. Particularly up overhead. We talked about scapulohumeral rhythm the other day, and that's really what I look at a lot is, do they have, is that scapula moving evenly? Is it moving in coordination with the humerus? Are they substituting elevation for upward rotation of the scapula?
Yep.
So they're overusing the upper traps. And again, so chest tightness. And then the other thing too is just that tight upper trap, that scapular elevation piece
Yep.
that many people just live in, or as soon as they go to lift something or pull something or push something, the shoulders come up.
Yep.
So those are probably the typical things. And then in terms of like rotator cuff issues, generally weak in terms of lateral rotation. So, medial rotation's reasonably strong on most people, but not everybody. Lateral rotation is often pretty weak. So those are the main things that I would say I see.
Yeah.
What about you? Anything to add?
Yeah. What I look at a lot of times is you look at all the muscles that attach to the scapula, because where the scapula sits is really, if it's not sitting in the right place, if it's upperly rotated, if you are round shouldered, if you see someone who's naturally round shouldered and you're standing behind them, you can pretty much guarantee that their scapula is sitting a little bit superior and a little bit lateral. And what we often see with that is that the scalenes get very tight, the SCM gets very tight, pec minor gets very tight. All of the deeper muscles that attach to the scapula, clavicle, the acromion area, the coracoid process, all of those muscles become a lot tighter. And something that dawned on me years ago, and that I have to remind people about, is just because a muscle is tight and shortened doesn't mean that it's strong. Often it's
absolutely
weak. So sometimes we do still have to work these muscles in a lighter capacity to remind it what it's supposed to do. So sometimes I'll take a look at those muscles, especially the pec minor, and start saying, okay, we still need to work it. You and I were talking on Wednesday about just shoulder in general and how difficult it is to actually stretch just the pec minor, because we go to do a pec stretch and we get mostly the pec major because we're taking our humerus away from our chest, but we're really not affecting the change of the scapula a ton. We're getting a little bit, obviously, but it's not changing it a ton, that sometimes we need to do a little bit more manual release work. So I have a tendency to look at that aspect and see what's tight, as well as the back. Are we getting proper activation of the lower trapezius? Can that scapula sit down properly? Because that's something we see that, like you said, trap 1, really overactive. Trap 2, maybe overactive, maybe not. Maybe trap 1's doing all of the work. Rhomboids are often weak. And lower trapezius is like, oh, they're not even here. They've gone to lunch and they never came back. They're just done.
Exactly.
So it's one of those things we have to look at and say, okay, we need to create a balance on the scapula where the anterior muscles have some length to them, with some strength, but looking at length, but also getting strength in that posterior quadrant and the lower trapezius especially. So those are the things that I often will focus in on.
Yep, I think that's well said. And those are things that, again, 9 times out of 10 with clients, that's the issue. Right, that the scapular elevated. They're also a little bit forward tilted, which is it's not always used in terms of an anatomical term, but that's what that pec minor does. It lifts the scapula up over the rib cage and then rounds it over the top, like it kind of has it sneaking up over the top of the rib cage. And that counterbalancing that, you really need to get that lower trapezius going again, get some length in that pec minor.
Yeah. The best thing that I've found strategy-wise for releasing the pec minor is just taking a small ball, like a lacrosse ball, tennis ball, whatever you got, starting at the sternum and just sort of rolling the ball with a little bit of force toward the coracoid process, toward the glenohumeral joint. And just, keep doing that as you sort of shrug back, technically it is, but just sort of retract the shoulder blades at the same time. So you're stretching it, because again, I don't care where the humerus is at this point, because I'm really trying to focus on the pec minor. I'm trying to get deeper. So I'm trying to move my scapula into retraction as I'm doing that. I find that really can help release that muscle. And that's one that, like you said, we spend so much of our time round-shouldered, computers, watching TV, driving, eating, everything's sort of round-shouldered, that it really helps to just get that muscle to have a little bit of length.
Yep. And, to your point, length. And then what I liked what you also said was working it, not
Hmm.
just lengthening it, which is really important to get it dynamically working like you want it, but also working it. Because oftentimes, once you've released something, if you will, or once you lengthen something, then you actually want to create the dynamic strength in that area.
Yep.
And so, for that, like I'll exaggerate and really round the shoulders forward and pull the shoulders back and round the shoulders forward, not just scapular protraction and retraction, but really adding
Yep.
that shoulder over the top feeling, right? Rounding the shoulders forward, bringing them back and creating that dynamic action. Classic exercise we do, which we think about more for the serratus, is like the sternum drop.
Yep.
So on all fours, just dropping the chest down or reaching the chest back, which is primarily protraction, retraction of the scapula, but can also be a little bit of that pec minor action happening there as well, because you're really moving the scapula regardless of where the glenohumeral joint is.
And how many people do you know when you try and put them? I call it a serratus push-up, where you're literally
Yeah.
trying to use the serratus primarily. But you're right, you're absolutely right. You are using the pec minor. And I like it in sort of the plank position on the forearms, just because in a straightened arm position, they try and get their triceps, they bend their elbows. And I'll do it on a
Right.
table. I can do it on a wall or something like that so we can de-weight the body. But how many people can't even figure out how to do that?
Exactly.
They don't have the strength. Their serratus and their pec minor are like, excuse me, you want me to do what? Huh?
Yeah.
And it takes a while for them to learn it. And even once they do learn it, I've had some guys that you look at them and they look like they'd be pretty strong. And after 2 sets of 10 or 12, they're fatigued and they can barely get out another repetition, or their form really starts to suffer after, 7 or 8 on the second or third set. So you can see how much endurance they lack in those muscles that are postural.
That are, essentially postural.
Yeah,
right?
they keep the scapula where it needs to be.
Right. No, I've had that experience as well. It's like, and it was interesting because the people that I've had that problem with the most were some massage therapists I work with,
Oh, yes.
who are using their upper body in a particular way, but man, the support for that scapula, which they're using in some very particular moves, was not there at all.
Yep.
They had no stability whatsoever of the scapula, and the serratus was just out to lunch.
Interesting.
And pec minor in that as well. Yeah. And it was one of those moments of like, it happened a few times and I thought that's interesting because they're using that movement, but they're usually using it with some scapular protraction and they're not really ever getting into the retraction.
It's that, and we were harped on this when I went to massage school, using your legs more. Don't use your arms.
Right.
So you almost lock out the position in your arms, not necessarily locked out, but you are in sort of a protracted, you're stabilizing, and you're using more of a lunge so you can use your body to create that effleurage, that, flow, that glide. So, you're not thinking about actually doing that protraction, retraction as, a piece that really we need it to do. But at the same time, if that's all you did as a massage therapist, you would wear out in a heartbeat.
Yes, exactly.
So, yeah, I can totally see why they teach that. But at the same time, that would lead to people who don't have good rhythm of that area.
So, pec minor.
Yeah.
Then the next piece that I find takes some time to develop is getting that lower trap going and changing that pattern of always lifting the shoulders up and elevating on any kind of effort with the upper body. I mean, that's so common. And, you can cue it all day long, right? You can say like, drop your shoulders, drop your shoulders, drop your shoulders, which we all do, but that doesn't necessarily make the difference, right? Yes, they can do it when they're conscious of it, but I think a lot of our goal with movement pattern imbalances like that is we're actually trying to get that to be a habit. We're trying to change the musculoskeletal habit so that you don't have to remind them every single time they lift their arms, because if they're doing it in your gym or your studio, they're doing it all the time.
All the time. Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. No, I agree that trying to bust through some of these habits that are perpetual are always going to be the issue. Getting that lower trapezius to fire is probably the hardest muscle group of the upper body that it's been challenging, put it that way. It's always been the biggest challenge. And I found some exercises that actually do work very well over, that, toes and nose against the wall, pulling one arm back, and especially if you can get them strong enough so they are in a prone position and they can lift one arm off the ground, like swimming, does get that muscle firing. But you have to make sure that they have good rhythm in that area to begin with, or else all it is trap one doing all of the work.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So how do you work that? How do you work the lower trap?
The exercise that I use for most people is what I call it toes and nose, and it's you stand against the wall, toes against the wall, nose against the wall, arms up overhead. Now, I tell them whatever feels comfortable. For some people, it's a little wider like a Y. For some people, it's narrower like an I. I don't over cue that because whatever's comfortable for them, I find is going to, everybody's shoulder joint's a little bit different. I usually find a little bit off center works best for most people. Not a huge Y, but sort of like a little bit of a Y. And again, everybody's shoulder is different. And I say, okay, keep your chest against the wall, keep your nose, keep your toes, everything against the wall, and now pull one arm straight back.
Okay.
And as they pull back, and I don't cue thumb forward, thumb back, none of that stuff, just whatever comes naturally to begin with. And as they do it, I will palpate, I will tap their lower trapezius just to wake it up. At first, I try and feel if I can even feel it firing. But once I start tapping it a little bit, it wakes it up a little, and I can see that it starts to drop because as we take our arm overhead, especially as we try and reach it behind us with a straight arm, we're going to naturally get depression of that scapula. That scapula will want to drop down again. So that's what I'm trying to encourage. I'm trying to encourage that to drop down as that arm goes behind. And again, if you do it with them in a prone position, their arm weighs too much. But against the wall, they're not going against gravity. So it de-weights it pretty much. And I find they can relax the hands on the hands and arms on the wall so they're not holding their arms up. It's not a struggle to hold them up. And I find having them do that 10 or 15 times on each side, a couple sets, and have them do it at home regularly really wakes it up and wakes it up quickly. And then I can eventually get them to pull both arms back at the same time.
So I take a little bit of a different approach, which just is interesting because I think it might be complementary. Rather than working on lifting the arms, essentially, right behind you in that position, I do focus on a bit of a Y for sure. I really don't have them close to the head, kind of a medium Y with the arms out. And then rather than lifting back, I actually have them slide the scapula towards each other. So basically bringing it like downward rotation, bringing the bottom tip of the scapula together. And I've done this prone. Prone works pretty well. I've also done it prone on a roller. So the arms are slightly in front of you, which is a little bit better. I've done it against a wall. And then for some of my clients, once they get that feeling, then I'll actually add typically on the trap table or with more likely actually with a band. I prefer a band for this because I don't like a lot of resistance and I want it to be kind of easy. But holding on to a band at that angle. So let's say the band is attached high up on the trap table or high up on whatever your pulley system is. And then have them pull down against that resistance and again into bringing that scapula together. And that's been fairly effective, I would say, as well. So I would add, I would do that, and then I would also add the lift that you do. I think that's a good combination.
I usually start with the toes and nose first. And the reason I do that is I also have two other exercises that I will do once it's woken up. And one of them is very similar to what you do, where I put them on sort of like a pull-down machine or something where it's a high cable. I like having a bar because I like having it a little wider. I find a little width helps. And I put a little bit more weight than what their arms would weigh, put it that way. So that it's actually going to pull them up a little bit. It's going to pull their arms up just a little bit so they can feel that. So they can actually begin to feel their scapula pulling down and back as they pull. Now, the reason I don't start with that exercise is because I find they try and overdo it with their lats every time or their biceps. They don't have the coordination yet. So a lot of times, if you're even just teaching a simple exercise like a pull down, whether it be with a band or cable or whatever, and you're doing that pull, people have a tendency to try and pull with their biceps a lot more, and they end up actually using that pec minor, pec major, and bicep to pull in the front because it's generally stronger than the back muscles. So I like to wake it up first with toes and nose, then go into that retraction. I call it lower retraction. And another one that I really like once I've woken it up is chair push-ups, a dip, basically. With a straight arm, just I take them into one of the offices here, grab an office chair, and I said, okay, I'm going to have you put your hands on the arms of the chair, straighten them out. So your butt's off of the chair. Now, basically shrug, let your body weight go toward the seat, but keep your elbows straight, and then push back up.
Yep.
And I used to do this on a dip machine, but I found it was quite challenging for older clients and things. And I realized, hey, office chairs, they work too. And a lot of people have these at home. So you guys can do this at home, or do it at the office just to wake that up. And I do focus on retraction because, they're going to want to be in a protracted position. So think about lifting that chest as you do it. But that's another way to get it going once I've activated it, once I've sort of woken it up.
You do the same thing on the Pilates chair with the handles.
Yes.
It's basically our version of the dip machine, where your feet are on the pedal, and so you've got that lift and that support for the body weight. And it is a really nice place for them to work straight arm shrugs, right? Because they really can lock it out and work that, and it gets that desire of the elbow bend to not happen as much. Interesting. And that's kind of why I start with just the slide first, without the resistance. So they get that idea of working it with a straight arm and get that feeling. And again, I'll use the tapping as well too, because a lot of times that area is just sleepy. I also tend to do it single arm.
Okay.
I'll do one arm at a time, because I often find that that's really different on the two sides. And something, an analogy I've used a lot is the back of the body is generally a sleepy spot. People don't know what's happening back there. They don't have a lot of sensation back there. And there's not a lot of nerve endings in our back body in a lot of ways. So I find I've got to help them feel what the heck I'm trying to have them do. And again, tapping, hands there, more resistance, less, whatever I need to do to get that feeling going so they can feel it themselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, they all work really well. Now, I will say, one client taught me probably more about getting retraction working than any other. He was a guy that I had that had Parkinson's. And if you've worked with anybody with Parkinson's, they all develop this bear-like look, or a lot of them do, where they're very rounded. They can't really propel themselves necessarily in a walk, so they have sort of a stutter step where they lean forward and they catch themselves. So their body is, the ones I've worked with tend to be leaning forward. And this gentleman had, his scapula were so far apart from each other. You look at it, you think, how is that possible? And he literally couldn't retract back, to the point that I was wondering, I said, has he damaged the fibers that they no longer can, the Z lines and A lines can't, cross over each other anymore? And I'm thinking in my head, no, that's physiologically not possible. But my brain is wondering, what's going on? Because he had nothing. What worked was taking him to a corner in the gym, having us put his arms in the corner with bent elbows and just lean forward. And I stood behind him and physically squeezed his shoulder blades back together, opening his shoulders. I said, now just hold this. And I kept tapping the scapula, tapping the lower, trapezius and middle trapezius. I kept tapping. I said, I want you firing here, 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 squeeze, 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 squeeze. And then let him come out of it. And then do it again. Then I'd have him drop his arms or take his arms away from the wall, but continue to squeeze and continue to tap. Because that just woke the area up. And after I did that for a week or two, working with him, I worked with him 3 times a week. All of a sudden, once I moved him there, he could hold it. And then slowly, with my help, I was able to get him to be able to squeeze back into that position. And after, like I say, a couple of weeks, he was doing it on his own, and finally and he said, I can feel it now. I know what you want me to do. But it was waking it up. It was that dormant. Those muscles were completely dormant, and they were not inspiring whatsoever. So I found that by leaning in and getting his body weight to push the scapula together was a great way just to get him in position, wake it up. Again, using palpation, just tapping, seemed to work.
Nice. Nice. One other tool I've used similar, this is for kind of scapular depression, a little bit of downward rotation, end of the trap table with the push through bar. Usually and trap table is easiest because I want somebody sitting underneath it with their arms straight. So the bar is holding the bar up overhead,
I got
basically.
You. Yep.
And I put on a fair bit of resistance on that. Like sometimes I'll put on even 2 short reds in the Pilates environment. And basically, again, keep the elbow straight. Sometimes I have to really like lock your elbow, and pull it down.
Yep.
And sometimes they're pulled a little to the side so the arm isn't straight overhead, but is a little bit of that angle, and pull it down and come up and pull it down and come up. And much like with your guy, what I've noticed with that, I'll also do something else, but with just the up and down motion, is people find how to do that, how to move the scapula, period, because there's some resistance there.
Yes.
Right? It's like they've got, like you're forcing him to do it by letting his body weight move his scapula together.
Yep.
In this case, like that bar will literally lift their shoulder blade up. So they feel like, oh, it's lifted up. I need to pull it down. It gives them that sensation. And that's something where if I've done that like a couple times, or, like it's the same twice a week, I do it a couple times each week for 2 or 3 weeks, and it completely changes how their scapula move.
And you're doing it facing sideways, unilateral.
I'm facing away from the trap table. So usually they're sitting on a box, facing away from the trap table.
I'm with you.
With their hand on the push-to bar, which is again overhead, kind of lifting their arms up. If you don't have a full-size trap, all of them sitting on the floor or sitting them on a short box, or whatever, and it's one at a time, and they're sitting a little bit to the side. They're not centered, so the arm's a little wide, and they just pull it down, and straight arm just pull that down and lift it up, and pull it down and lift it up.
Yep.
And that's also, it's a really nice place to watch how the scapula moves, and how the 2 different scapula may move differently.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing I can see is when I'm pulling it down, I'm kind of looking for the scapula. I call it a J. The scapula kind of comes straight down, and then at the end pulls in, right? A little bit of pull into that lower trapezius and a bit of that downward rotation at the end.
Yep.
And oftentimes when I'm first working with it, like this guy you're talking about, I wouldn't see that bottom J. It would just go down and up and down and up, and it wouldn't have that last little piece.
Yep.
And training that last little piece, again, it hasn't taken long with that amount of sensation. Same thing with your guy, like that much sensation for them to feel it made all the difference.
Yeah.
And straightened it up pretty quickly.
Interesting. I've always done that with the trap table facing sideways off the table, off the back end, but facing sideways so I can adjust how far away from the machine I want them. So I can adjust, where the arm is. I've never done it facing the table. So that's an interesting thing where you can, I'm going to have to play with that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, you can do it sideways as well. Again, some non-traditional exercise. You can figure out what works.
Yeah,
That's interesting. I haven't done it sideways, but.
Yeah, I think I probably did that just because of where my thing is in the room. It worked better sideways. So I was like, okay. Necessity, mother of invention.
It is the mother. One other thing that I want to mention there is we're talking a lot about getting scapula depression to happen, right? Getting the scapula to move down because they tend to move up habitually. But the other thing that I'll often do, which is, again, maybe a little counterintuitive, is I'll have people do shrugs like mad. Because what I find is, yes, those tend to be short. The upper traps are a little bit on the short side, but they're not necessarily strong or dynamic at all.
Yeah.
And so I'll have them even without any resistance, just do 10 little shoulder shrugs, just lifting the shoulders up and down, up and down, up and down.
Yep.
And for more than one client, they're exhausted and their neck hurts after that.
Yes.
Right. It's like it does not take much. And that also lets me know that that's just a pattern that doesn't have the strength. The tissues are not getting nourished the way they should by dynamic action. And very often, too, that allows them to bring the shoulders down because they can release the shoulders up, right? They just get more dynamic range in those muscles.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I find I've done the same thing by beginning to train the traps. And I'll do it I usually use shoulder rolls, and I prefer back than forward. I prefer doing shoulder rolls back. That's just, I think
Yeah, me too.
It works better. But yeah, and I'll do that, and I'll say do it 15 times. And afterwards, you can see they're like, oh, man. And I'm thinking, I didn't even put a weight in your hand yet. There's no bands. There's nothing.
Exactly.
It's just your arms. And,
Exactly.
These muscles are so fatigued. They get fatigued so easily. And you're right. And then we can begin to progress them into doing it. I find that with shrugs, especially with people going to a gym, and there's a lot of trainers who do this, they'll say, oh, you can handle a lot of weight here. And they'll have the person do, I've seen trainers hand women 20-pound dumbbells. They'd never do that for any other exercise, but for shrugs, they'll do that. And I'm thinking, interesting, and be able to do it 10 times. But of course, they're just jerking it up instead of doing it, easy and slow and controlled. So starting with no resistance and begin to work your way up. You will get stronger fairly quickly, but higher reps always for these muscles work better, I find.
Yeah. I'd much rather do higher reps because these are not necessarily power muscles.
No.
These are holding your shoulders up all the time muscles. These are endurance muscles.
They are endurance muscles, but too many.
Right? I mean, your job's to hold your scapula up all day. Every time you're in gravity, it's keeping your scapula from falling down your body. That's
exactly
what they're doing.
Exactly. But remember, in fitness land, started with bodybuilders. So they're trying to build their trapezius to be bigger. And you got to do that through heavy weights. And it's true. If that's your goal, that's fine. That's not our goal with, a 65-year-old, person who just wants to be able to pick up their grandchild.
No, not so much. We just want it to function in a balanced and dynamic way. We don't necessarily need it to be gigantic.
Exactly. And the thing I notice about all these imbalances are oftentimes we see a progression, or I see a progression, that things will start with something as simple as a muscular imbalance where we see that they have improper scapulohumeral rhythm or overly tight, traps, upper cross syndrome, something of that nature. But it can develop into more of a medical pathology. And I think that's where we should step into now and start talking about things like the rotator cuff and rotator cuff impingement, tendinitis, tears, the different types of tears that there are, going into, the difference between those and bicipital tendinitis, because, we're constantly here. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I constantly hear, oh, I have bicipital tendinitis, yet they exist, their bicep, it never hurts if they use their bicep. It's like, okay, it hurts your shoulder when you do external rotation. Okay. And I don't want to say the doctor's wrong because I'm sure that there's inflammation in that whole area, but they're not exhibiting symptoms that would point me in that direction. But it's like, okay, that's fine. We're going to work all of it.
So, Brian, we discussed, Brian and I work on a project called Advancement Principles. And as part of that, we're filming a bunch of these ideas. And when I was doing the research for that and really looking at what happens, a lot of the issues with the shoulder, and I'm going to talk specifically about the area around the glenohumeral joint as a thing. What you realize when you start to look at the literature is, okay, that is one tiny space. So those of you who have any anatomy background, you have your acromion of your scapula. That's like the roof. And underneath that, you have your supraspinatus tendon that goes right between that acromial roof and the head of the humerus, right through along the top of that glenohumeral joint, right? Puts that together. You've got bursas in there.
Yep.
You've got your biceps tendon that comes up and attaches onto the top of the glenoid fossa, right underneath that. And all that stuff is in a space that's, maybe 5 millimeters, maybe half an inch wide, maybe a quarter of an inch wide. And every single time you lift your arms up overhead, you potentially shrink that space, especially if you don't upperly rotate the scapula and your scapulohumeral rhythm isn't working, and you're over depressing the scapula, lifting the arm up, you shrink that space even more.
Absolutely. And they say 10 millimeters is what, it should be. And I say that was probably on a 16-year-old, who's perfectly healthy.
With good biomechanics.
Exactly. Who's very flexible, great biomechanics. Most of us, I find it's probably a lot smaller. And just think about how small 10 millimeters is. Okay, it's a centimeter.
That's half an inch.
Yeah, it is
roughly.
tiny.
That's not big.
It is not big, and there's a lot of things going through that area. Let's review what we talked a little bit about last time with the rotator cuff. Basically, it's a force couple where we have these four muscles whose job really isn't to rotate the arm as much as it is to have proper placement of where that humerus is as the arm moves up. It downwardly, it pulls the humerus down into the joint basically as we lift our arm up. So if they're not doing their job, that area shrinks even more, and that's where we do get that impingement.
Yeah. And one of the challenges, and I think you brought this up and I was thinking about it a lot, is again, a client will come in with a diagnosis in that area.
Yep.
A rotator, supraspinatus tear, biceps tendonitis, shoulder bursitis. Those are the, sort of the typical ones that I see a lot. And if you start to explore it a little bit, you realize kind of it's all going on at the same time.
Exactly.
Right. That the area is so small that if one piece of that is inflamed, it kind of spreads that inflammation around.
Yep.
That it'll irritate the rotator cuff, it'll irritate, or if that's irritated, it'll irritate the bursa that lies right over it. It may irritate the attachment of the biceps tendon.
Yep.
So things may get a little bit swollen, things get a little bit more irritated. They take up more of that space and boom, Bob's your uncle, as they say.
If you guys want to do something, go on your Google machine and type into your browser, shoulder impingement. There are a lot of great pictures of what it looks like when the arm elevates and what's being squeezed. Okay, that joint capsule that's supposed to work nice and fluid and pump, synovial fluid into the area and keep it nice and lubricated. You've got that, you've got the supraspinatus tendon, you got the biceps tendon, you got the bursa. All of those things now are being compressed and being squeezed. And again, if it happens a few times, not a big deal. But I say that there is a point where that straw that broke the camel's back. And for me, I blew mine out. I remember the exact thing I was doing. Okay, I was painting. I was painting overhead, had my little brush. Okay, now, I'm going to give you a little backstory. I was getting into bodybuilding, and of course, like a typical young person, I was doing a lot of anterior shoulder girdle stuff, so a lot of dips and bench press and pec flies and all the things. In the front, was I doing any back exercises? Probably not. Maybe one, maybe a pull down, maybe, I'm not sure. But I was focused so much on what I could see in the mirror because I'm young and dumb. But here I am, I'm painting my mom's gym. And literally, I went up with one stroke and my arm literally fell. I could not control it down and it just dropped to my side. And I looked at it and I thought, what's going on? And I went to move it again and it wouldn't move very well without pain. It gave me no indication before that moment. And I've heard this happens with baseball pitchers a lot. Baseball pitchers, they say the trainers will know when they've blown it out. Because when they throw the ball, they throw it and it actually comes across, their arm comes across the body and hits their opposite hip basically and bounces back. Because that rotator cuff has some flexibility to it. Okay, the tissues have some recoil, so that arm comes across the body, sort of hits the hip and bounces back. They say they know when they've blown it out when it doesn't bounce back, when it just goes down and stops dead. They say that's the moment, and you can see it. I've seen it in some videos where the arm, they'll throw it, and you can see them wince, and their arm will just drop. And I said, that's exactly what happened to me. And that's not the only way it happens, but I had overworked it so much and probably ignored a bunch of symptoms along the way because you're young, you're dumb, you're just like, oh, I've got muscle soreness. And it blew out. And it took me nearly a year to figure out what was going on because I was young. I didn't want to go to the doctor. I didn't, I'm going to figure this out myself. I was ignorant as heck. But it took about a year to the point it hurt so bad. I had a stick shift car. I had to learn how to drive underhanded, holding my right arm's the one I hurt. I had to shift with my left hand. I mean, it was that bad. I had to learn to eat with my left hand, brush my teeth. because I couldn't use my arm. It hurt so much. I was constantly inflaming it. Again, young, dumb, keep working it out. We'll make it stronger. Yeah, that doesn't work. But again, that taught me a whole lot. And once I did get into the doctor, they were like, oh, you have rotator cuff impingement. Got it. And once I started doing the right things, man, within weeks, I started feeling better. But it took about a year before I was 100%. Those tissues, there's so much going on in such a small area that it's very, very difficult to know exactly what's wrong. And for someone who may have a biceps tendon issue, may have a slight rotator cuff tear, or or a slight labral tear, or all of this. All of those things are happening in a very small area. And I hate to say, unless, even if you do the MRI, you don't know which one's actually talking to you at that moment. Because they're all angry.
And one of the things that this really, like when I worked at St. Francis a long time ago, and was doing a lot of research on the shoulder, this was before things have gotten really sophisticated as they are. This gets us back to the root of what we do as movement professionals, which is, as best we can, correcting and balancing all the forces around that joint.
Yes.
Because to your point, I'm talking about I've got some funky shoulder things happening, and it's like, I'm poking around in there, and it's like, oh, my triceps is on fire for no good reason. So I work on the triceps, and then it's like, oh, my pec minor is like, feels like it makes me want to barf when I put pressure on it, right? I'm like, this is a really horrible feeling. And then my biceps is a little funky. And so you start to see too how that inflammation influences, myofascially influences all the tissues that come into that area.
Yep.
Like the pec major goes right over the biceps tendon, for example. So if the pec major is tight, it'll compress that biceps tendon in the bicipital groove. The way that the lat comes over and lands on just the other side of that bicipital groove, right? So you got pec, you got biceps, you got lat right in a tiny space on the humerus. This isn't even talking about, really up at the glenohumeral joint. You've got the labrum, you've got, all those issues going on up there as well.
Yep.
And they all talk to each other. And it's again where looking at balance, looking at what is not what is the root necessarily, but how can I get the entire biomechanics of the area working more effectively? Now, if there is a true supraspinatus tear, the body will compensate in ways that I've found. If it's a true complete tear, you can't compensate for that very well. You just can't.
If it's a true tear, you can't lift the arm the first 30 degrees. I mean, the supraspinatus is responsible pretty much for that first 30 degrees of abduction. Without that muscle, if that muscle is torn completely, something else has to start it. And you're going to have all sorts of compensations, especially in trap one.
Right. Yeah. Typically for me, it's exactly that. It's just that instead of, and you'll see this, if you've got somebody who you suspect a rotator cuff tear with, and maybe they haven't been to the doctor yet, or they're a new client or whatever, if they go to lift that arm and the very first thing they do is lift their shoulder up and elevate that with trap one, then that's almost always like, well, you need to go get that checked out, because that's always making me suspicious that supraspinatus is at least partially torn, if not completely torn. And if they really cannot do it without lifting that scapula up, then it's almost like, I don't know, 9 times out of 10, or every time I've mentioned that, it's like they need the rotator cuff is torn. The supraspinatus is actually torn.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. There is a difference between a partial tear and a full tear.
Absolutely.
And a partial tear, it's normally always the supraspinatus tendon, just because of where it lies. It's right there. It's going to sort of, the way I tell people is, it's kind of like every time you lift up the arm, if you don't have good integrity of the rotator cuff, you're sawing into that muscle every single time you lift your arm and do anything, very slowly, but you're creating these little tears. Eventually, it can tear the muscle.
Yeah.
And a partial tear will lead to incredible amounts of discomfort and pain. And that's, to me, that's the telltale sign of a partial tear when they tell me it's torn, is because they still have pain. They still have pain in that direct area.
Yep. When they lie on it, when they wake up in the morning, when it's cold,
Yep.
it's kind of it's an icky thing for most people I know that have those. It's a little relentless.
And a lot of older clients I find don't have whatever it is, the healing ability, that it rarely
Yeah.
heals the way if I see a 22-year-old with it, I'm pretty much sure that it's going to heal itself. It's going to,
Yeah.
mend. You'll get scar tissue in the area, it'll mend. 65, 70-year-olds, you're not going to see it as easily because those tissues aren't healing as rapidly.
Right.
And they may not have enough hydration. They may not have enough just
Yeah.
nutrition to be able to do that. But it's something that's going to plague them, and it's something that they're going to have to constantly work on if they decide not to have surgery. Now, a full tear, and a lot of times a partial tear can become a full tear sometimes, depending on, I've had two different people. One fell over the dog in the middle of the night. It was lying in the hallway, landed on his shoulder, blew it out, went from a partial to a full. The other one, which I found very interesting, she came to me, and her husband was a physician. So, of course, they know everything. Sorry, had to throw that in there. But, they knew exactly what was wrong, and it was a partial tear. Perfect. Had the MRI, no problem. She came back from a trip. They traveled a lot. And she said, I just watched her move. And she said, yeah, my shoulder doesn't hurt anymore, but my neck is killing me. And I said, lift your arm out to the side. And as she did it, only trap one worked. And I said, when did this start happening? And she said, oh, when we were getting off the plane in, I think, Egypt, I think they were going to the Middle East. And I said, you pulled your bag out of the overhead. She goes, how'd you know? And I said, you heard a pop, didn't you? She goes, yeah. Well, as that bag pulled down, it distracted the joint. And it was the last little bit that took it. And after that, she said, my shoulder stopped hurting. It wasn't killing me like it was before. And I said, well, no, you don't have the muscle anymore. That's part of it. But now she had the trap one was killing her. Her neck was unbelievably inflamed because of it. And so I was like, okay, you are going to the doctor today. We are not working out that area, obviously.
Yeah.
Because there's little I can do at that point. You can't, like you said, those compensations are going to be there. You can't get around it.
My experiences with a full tear, and this is different in different places, right? Like I know people that have an unreconstructed intercruciate ligament, for example. That's not that uncommon,
Yep.
even with dancers and some people that I've worked with that just chose not to reconstruct.
Yep.
They could manage the strength in that area with a lot of work
Yep.
to keep that stable. My clients who really have a full tear of that supraspinatus without reconstruction, those compensations are profound, and I haven't found a way to get those mechanics working correctly again. I don't know if you have, but I'm not. Partial tear, yes, absolutely, I can work with it, but if that muscle's really gone, I haven't found a good way to make that work.
No, you can stabilize the joint by strengthening everything around it, and you can actually use the deltoid to help stabilize the joint. But when you ask it to move,
yeah, exactly. That's the problem.
That's
if you really want to go overhead, it's going to be weird.
That supraspinatus, the way it's designed, how it sort of sits up and over the humeral head, actually when it pulls in and contracts, it rotates the head of the humerus downward, and then the infraspinatus, teres major or minor, can actually help pull that down even further. Without it initiating that rotation, all that happens is that humerus goes north. It's always
which leads to more impingement. Right, which basically just reinforces the whole problem you're already having.
Exactly. And you made an interesting comment earlier about, waking up with the pain and you can't lie on it and everything. Something to think about. And when I was first told this, it sort of blew my mind. Have you ever really seen a really hugely inflamed shoulder joint? You don't often see that because the inflammation actually occurs within the joint capsule on the inside of it. So unlike the knee where you can see it from across the room, I mean,
it's blown up, right?
Yeah, or an ankle or something like that, you can see it. It's easy. The shoulder joint and the hip joint as well, I find, you don't often see a lot of the inflammation exteriorly. But
as puffiness or whatever, or as
right,
redness. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
pressure, lying on it,
Yeah.
that
Yep.
night
Yep.
pain, and we call it night pain. And as long as they have night pain, if they roll over on it, it wakes them up and they have to turn back over to the other side, or they can't lie on it,
Yep.
period. That always tells me there's still inflammation there.
Yep.
And a lot of times, my job, I know what I'm really good at. When it comes to inflammation, I say leave that to the medical professionals. There's all sorts of things that they can
Yes,
do with
that's
that.
they can do something with that.
Yeah,
We can work on the muscles and the strength and the stuff, but the inflammation is a
yeah,
physiological process.
exactly. And, I will suggest ice, just to help initially, but it's like, look, talk to your doctor. There's many different options when it comes to medication, shots, whatever you want to do. That we need to get the inflammation down before you can really do a whole lot and strengthen the area, because you're just upsetting the apple cart the whole time.
Yeah.
And so for me, a lot of times I will focus on just working that rotator cuff, internal and external rotation, shrugs, small movements, scapular retraction, especially in the prone position,
Mm-hmm.
even getting into a T in the prone position. W's they usually can't do because of inflammation, but just those
Mm-hmm.
positions that they can get into and work comfortably. I'll work with that until the inflammation is down. Then, when they don't have night pain, I can start saying, okay, now we can start doing other things. Now we can start building up a little bit more strength in the other posterior shoulder girdle muscles, in rows and things like that. But if you try and do that right at the beginning, it just keeps adding more and more to the inflammation, I find.
So let's talk through that strategy, because I've played with a bunch of different strategies with somebody with shoulder issues generally. And again, I'm taking this as a broad category
Yes.
of issues, not any of the specific ones, but something's going on in that shoulder.
Yep.
So so I often begin with just no resistance rotator cuff work.
Yep.
Right, just arms at your sides, just no TheraBands, no nothing,
Yep.
no resistance, just simple. Just to see if the mobility is there and to try to get some strength in the deepest support muscles for that area.
Yep.
Now, that's not going to get my supraspinatus particularly, right, because that's an abductor, that's not a rotator, but it'll at least get the other stabilizers of the glenohumeral joint. Most clients, I'm trying to think if anybody couldn't tolerate, every client I've worked with shoulder pain could tolerate that.
Most, yep.
Yeah, I can think of the most extreme shoulder I can think of that I worked with, could only do it like sitting up with no resistance, arms straight, just medial and lateral rotation, and had pretty good range on both sides and could do that without increasing pain. Okay, step one.
Yep. And that's arm bent to 90 degrees.
Could be the arm straight.
Oh, arm straight, just rotating completely.
Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of times I'll just do it because if there's a biceps issue or something, sometimes even just having that elbow bend can be a problem.
Yep.
Plus, you can limit internal rotation with the arm bent because you run into your body.
Yep.
Right. So just straight arm simple. And then, of course, you can start to add resistance to that, add bands to that, add other kinds of ways of doing that. But I start with that. Knowing too that is, just a reminder of that's an endurance exercise, not a strength exercise. You want to go for repetition, not weight. So if they never add weight to that, I've got no problem with that. If they could do 40 or 50 like rotations with no weight, that's fine.
Yep.
So it's step one. And then the next thing that I've played with is two things, and I'll see what works here, is essentially I'll do a little bit of bicep strengthening, simple, and I'll usually do it with the arm at the side. So not like the arm out in front of me with a right angle between my humerus and my torso, but just like my arms at my sides, just a little simple elbow bend, right? So they're relatively neutral in their glenohumeral joint. Same thing with the tricep. So I'll do a little bit of just strengthening for the upper arm muscles. A lot of times that's also tolerable as long as I keep the weight pretty light and I keep them in that position. So again, the arm isn't lifted up at all. It's just gravity hanging at their side. They're just either pulling something back or pulling something in. Then working from there, I also will just play with scapula mobility. And it may be as simple, again, this is like baby steps, but as simple as just pulling the shoulders back, like retraction and protraction without anything else happening.
Yep.
So looking at the mobility, looking at just waking up the area, seeing how much of that is tolerable. And a lot of times that's tolerable. Maybe I'll do some of the all fours, sternum push-ups, or as we call them, sternum drops, right? Scapular push-ups, if they can tolerate that.
Mm-hmm.
And then like adding resistance, like simple little bicep curls or rows, things below 90 degrees is my next step. So the shoulders
Okay.
are always, the humerus is always below 90. So starting low, maybe they're right at the side of the torso, like I'm doing a row with the arms right against the side of the body, right? Keeping it really small. And then slowly building the arms so that they're wider and wider, farther away from the body, more abducted or more flexed.
Yep.
And then last step, which as you said, you really after once inflammation is really down, then I start to work on anything overhead
Right.
or anything above 90. And that's kind of my general, mobility, a little bit of strength, slowly building the arms up so they're not just at the sides, and then gradually going overhead. Just wanted to see if that made sense.
Oh, it makes total sense. I hit it a little differently often.
Yeah. Yeah.
I will start them with internal and external rotation, usually unweighted, just whatever's tolerable. I'm also looking at range of motion because anytime I take someone into external rotation, and usually the arm is at, bent to 90 degrees, the elbow, some people can only get till it's straight in front of the body. Anything more lateral than that begins to hurt. So I'll just note that. Some people can go a lot further, and I'll note that as well. Then I may try and do, again, just trying to do range of motion, then adding a little bit of isometric, where I will use myself just putting one finger of pressure and have them hold it for 2 or 3 seconds. And when I do that, I'm not doing it fast. I'm gradually picking up. So in a course of maybe 3 or 4 seconds, I'm starting with 0, going up a little bit, and then decreasing. Up a little bit, and almost like you're revving up your engine in a car. You start off with very low RPMs, you take it up a little bit, and you go back down. And as I do it, I start increasing that repetition. Now, or increasing the resistance. One thing that I will find is in that range of motion, usually there's one spot that's sort of an iffy spot, so to speak.
Right, a hot spot.
A hot spot, exactly.
Yeah.
I will approach that, but stop just before they're into that area. And that's where I'll begin to start strengthening using isometric. Because a lot of times you can bridge through that painful by approaching it, but not attacking it. Many people will say, go through. No, if the full range of motion hurts because at a certain degree it bothers you, train it above or below that sort of area in isometric, and you can often bridge that area. It's called physiologic overload. You can actually bridge that until they can do full range of motion. Then start them with half a pound lying on their side, half a pound of external rotation. Build them up. I don't think in my entire career I've ever gotten anybody beyond 10 pounds of external rotation side lying, and that was me. Mainly because you pointed out to me, your external rotators are they're not that big. You may want to work on those a little bit. And it was true. They needed some work, and I slowly increased my resistance. But remember, we don't want a lot of hypertrophy in these muscles because where do they go? They go through a very small area in the subacromial space. And while that's supposed to be the tendon, we all know tendon length can vary from person to person. So I'm not 100% sure that muscle's not going to hypertrophy toward that area. So
absolutely,
I try and keep the resistance down, but the reps up, and I'll work 30 to 50 repetitions sometimes when I've gotten them really going.
At that point. Yeah.
And I'll use rubber resistance. I also do something that I call the penguin, which I use a loop band and I put it around my hands in front of my body. And I'll do that first 30 degrees of abduction and back. And I'll have them rep that out. And I'll just, again, lightest band I can possibly find, and have them do it, build up to 30 to 50 repetitions. And the reason I say the penguin is it kind of looks like you're doing a little penguin walk.
Of course. No, the image is clear.
Yeah, and it works. And when I say, have you been doing your penguins? Everybody knows what I'm talking about. But I got to tell you, for the supraspinatus, it really wakes it up. and gets
Yeah.
it stronger fairly quickly. And with light resistance, you can get, when I'm warming mine up, I'll do that, and then I'll take the band to 90 degrees and I'll do external rotations, and I'll do 100 repetitions with a light band, because I'm just trying to flood that area with blood. I'm just trying to warm it up
Yeah,
before I work it
exactly. Get
out.
it going.
Yeah,
Yeah.
priming the pump. And it really helps to work that out. And again, it's something that I have a lot of clients who travel. It's easy to take one of those bands with them. You know, and you don't even have to buy a loop band. You can just tie a band, find,
Exactly.
the right,
Exactly.
length. But it does work. And I find that those exercises really work well, wakes the area up, get some integrity, and then I can begin to build their strength side lying with a dumbbell or something like that. Because then
Nice.
I can begin to build strength, and then PNF patterning, then I can get them into doing more of that sort of thing. And I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of overhead work in general. I'll do it for function, because we all have to reach the top shelf. If you travel, you got to be able to put your bag in the overhead. But I'm not big on overhead presses. I'm not big on that sort of thing, especially with the arms out to the side in the frontal plane. I prefer sagittal plane. I prefer keeping it, because as I sort of broke it down one day, I was thinking, well, if I'm doing an overhead press, if I stop with my forearm, with my upper arms level to the ground, that's the same as a front raise. It's just the weight is higher because it's closer to my body and my elbows bent. So I thought, okay, so I'm just raising my arm up a little higher than that. So I try and keep it more in the sagittal plane for people who do have rotator cuff issues. And then eventually begin to work that PNF patterning where they can reach overhead with that external, internal and external rotation in their arm. But it takes 6-9 months. This is not something that's going to happen over 2 to 3 weeks.
No, not at all.
This is a
No, that's why, again, anything above shoulder height is like in the distant future.
Yes.
Especially if there's in post-surgery as well.
Oh, yeah.
So I want to say a couple of things. That was great. Thank you very much. I thought I learned a lot from that. And again, the reminder from you about isometrics. I don't use isometrics enough. It just doesn't occur to me. So that was a really good reminder for me. And I like the penguin idea. Because I've always played with different ways of doing that, tiny supraspinatus activation, but I like that one. That's great. I'm going to incorporate that one. I'm going to steal that one, Brian. Thank
Please
you for
do.
that.
Everyone steal. Steal from everybody. Use it yourself. Something else to think about that, along with the isometrics, is eccentric.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I will just have them hold that isometric, and then I'll say, now control it down as I'm putting a little bit more resistance. Then I'll say, now you lift it up with no resistance, hold me, controlling it down. And, we all have probably done that with someone with a straight leg raise or something like that, because that's very common. But people forget about the rotator cuff.
Yeah.
But it works incredibly well. And again, you just take them to where they may have that little sticky area, that hot spot, hold them before they get to that, hold it, and then control it down. And as I'm having them control it down, I will increase the resistance that I'm pushing against it. And, it's just a way to begin to get them toward the concentric eccentric control on their own.
Yep. I love it. That's great.
So,
wow, there we go. That's a lot. That's good. That's great. That's a lot of, I think we covered a lot of good things there, looking at some of the imbalances, ways to deal with those in terms of mobility and strength and where you're trying to get to, and some exercise specifics. Then really, I think to wrap up what we were just talking about, when there is a shoulder problem, it again, unless there's a full supraspinatus tear, but almost anything else, you're looking at inflammation management, which is not your job.
Yep.
And then you're looking at, how do you gradually build up the balance and the strength in there. And I loved a couple of your examples of places where once the strength was there, things got better really quickly.
Yep.
And even clients, again, you thought were really strong, were weak in specific areas in the shoulder that were leading to those imbalances and leading to, shoulder impingement or whatever it was. So nice work. Yeah, this is cool.
Yeah. And something to think about in general when it comes to the shoulder joint, a lot of the pathologies have very similar, in a physical therapy term, treatment.
Yeah,
strategies.
exactly.
Some things
Yes.
to think about: increasing the subacromial space, just holding a weight,
Yes.
doing something like a pendulum. If you're unsure what that looks like, you can Google it. There's tons of tons of images out there and videos. You know, I do a lot of release work and a lot of anterior shoulder girdle stretching. So I'll put them on a foam
Yep.
roller to do the snow angels, or
Yep.
the doorway stretch if they can handle that. Some can, some can't. You got to figure out what works for them for stretching that area out. Release work for the lats, for the serratus. I find those are often
For the
tight.
triceps.
Triceps, big
All
time.
those.
So
Even the neck.
yes. So doing as
Yep.
much release work, and if you have a great manual therapist, oh, have at it. That's fabulous.
Yep. Yep.
Fabulous. And then you can begin to work on the strengthening and, trying to get the integrity back in the tissue. So it's not just the strengthening, but the other components are very important as well.
Really important. Key, actually,
Yeah.
I would say. Because I know, one last little tidbit there. If there is a real tight spot in the shoulder, if there is a real hang up, whether it's the pec minor is locked down, or the triceps is locked down, or the upper trapezius or the levator are just like in a state of kind of chronic tightness, that will change all the mechanics everywhere.
Everywhere.
Right. And then everybody else will be accommodating for that area that's like super tight. And
Yep.
again, given the lack of inherent stability of the shoulder, some muscle somewhere will often decide it's their job to stabilize and just log itself down.
Yep.
That's, what happens in the hip. Same thing happens in the shoulder. So I think that's where the manual work, the release work, figuring out where your body is compensating, like where it is tightening up like mad, and understanding how to get that to not quite do that and have the rest of the stabilizing system work together
Yep.
is really important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We gave you a lot to think about this week, didn't we?
I think so. I hope it's helpful to you guys. I'm sure you all had people with shoulder issues, so
Yes.
maybe this was somewhat helpful.
And down the road, I have a feeling we're probably going to go into a little bit more detail, because we didn't go into specific pathologies in too much depth. But down
Right.
the road, we can talk more about strict impingement or tendonitis and that, those sorts of things. So we'll cover that down the road. But right now, at least you have something that you can start with your client that comes from a physical therapist. You'll have a strategy. You'll have some ideas of, oh, this has worked for us. Maybe it'll work for you. So just a
Awesome.
couple of ideas. Well, thank you guys for joining us. It's been our pleasure as always. You can always catch us on our social media at Moving Combos on Instagram, at Moving Combos, Moving Combos at gmail.com. If you have any questions, comments, if you have any ideas, please send them our way. We answer everybody. Unlike a lot of people, we're pretty easy to get to. You can pretty much find us. I mean, we're out there. And we do answer every email that comes through. So, hit us up. Keep looking out for our anatominis. They're going to be coming out pretty soon on Instagram. So keep your eyes open. And yeah, I think we covered everything.
Thanks, guys. Good to see you.
We'll see you next time.